You're watching Cow Country USA on Beef Team TV on YouTube. Yeah, they're limit up. Limit up. I just looked on the feeders are limit up. Fats are up $1.25 or so. It's still early. Oh, we're live? Okay. Welcome everybody to Beef Team Webinar Library on Beef Team TV on YouTube. I'm glad you all could join us. Today we're going to have a little webinar, a little discussion on nutrition strategies for the cow herd, and kind of looking at that time frame between calving and breeding, because that's obviously one of our most critical times for cow nutrition. Now, most people at least in the north here, are probably calving or getting close to calving, and so there's some opportunities if there's some management adjustments that need to be made or what have you. We can still take a look at those types of things and just kind of see where we're at. Obviously, the goal here is the breeding season coming up and trying to get cows rebred, especially our heifers and our coming threes and those types of things are particularly challenging, especially after the year we had last year. So let's get into this a little bit and see where it takes us. Now, probably a good place to start out is taking a look at the nutrition requirements of the cow post-calving. And you can see here on the bottom of this chart is months after calving. And so, the obvious thing is you look about a month after calving, and that's when this cow is going to hit peak lactation. That's when the nutrient draw on her is going to be the highest throughout the year. And so, of course, that's when her nutritional plane needs to be the highest as well. Otherwise, she's going to start running off quite a bit of condition. Milk quality could be compromised. Calf performance could be compromised, so on and so forth. Our orange line at the top there represents the energy requirements of these cows as they go throughout the year. And obviously, again, it peaks about a month after calving when we hit that peak lactation, and then it kind of trickles off as we go through the summer till the point where, we start weaning calves, and that's when we're going to see nutritional or energy requirements being the lowest, and then it's going to start creeping back up as that cow is bred, calf and cider starts to grow, and it repeats the process over again. The gray line is protein requirements, and that's going to follow a similar trend to energy. Now, I think the most important thing that just the on-the-ground producer can do is study up a little bit on evaluating nutrition problems, okay? Because when we talk about, thin cows and fat cows and this and that and the other, well, you go into any herd and there's going to be a group of thin cows. And you go into any herd and there's going to be a group of fat cows. It doesn't matter what herd it is. So when we're talking about some of these nutritional problems, we need to break this down into some categories that can, give us some indications about what's really going on. Is there really a nutrition problem, or is it a symptom of some other management things that are going on? So if you look at the top of this slide here, you can see, typically I don't know that we necessarily need to go through the body condition scoring chart. Again, I think most people are well familiar with it. But so when we look at, anything less than a body condition score 4 is kind of considered thin. Certainly too thin to breed, and we'll show some data here to back that up in just a minute. And not necessarily that they won't breed. Obviously, some of them will, but it becomes very unpredictable which ones will breed, which ones won't. Once they get to a body condition score 4 or less. So when we're looking at 10 to 15% of the herd is starting to look a little thin. Maybe we've just got some individual issues. Maybe we've got a parasite problem. Those types of things. When it gets to be 25% of the herd is starting to look thin, now we got to start thinking about things like bunk space issues, When it gets to be 50% of the herd is starting to look thin, now we're looking at things like feed composition issues. There could be a lot of really low quality roughage, and there's not enough protein. It could be some various things like that. When it gets to greater than 50% of the herd is looking thin, now looks like, probably need to start looking into like a feed volume issue. They just simply aren't getting enough to eat. And it may be compounded by a quality issue as well. Now, going back a little bit to this body condition score thing, we were talking about how anything under a condition score 4 is kind of considered thin and could have some problems getting bred during the breeding season. This is a very well-known graph that looks at cow body condition score on the bottom and percent pregnant after the breeding season on the left. And you can see that only about 50% or cows that were in a body condition score 4, only about half of them bred. Okay, now we get up to a 5 and it's 81%, a 6 is 88%, and a 7 is 90%. And so what does that tell us about where cows need to be in terms of pregnancy success? Well, probably somewhere between a 5 and a 6. Obviously 90% is fantastic, but the reality is economically you probably can't afford to keep your cows in a body condition score 7 through the winter at calving, because that's going to be our primary predictor of pregnancy success. So we're probably looking on mature cows somewhere around a 5, on heifers maybe closer to a 6, and that's probably about where we need to be. So in terms of rations, let's talk a little bit about rations, and there's kind of two components to developing rations and feeding rations and those types of things. And the first thing is composition, and the second thing is intake. Okay, those are two components of any ration. So the composition of the ration is just simply the composition of each nutrient in the ration. So whether it's energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, what have you, we're just simply looking at how much actual nutrient composition is in the ration. Nutrient concentration is in the ration. Now, intake, on the other hand, is how much are they going to eat. And so, a typical cow will range anywhere from 1.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis to up to 2.7, maybe even 3% of body weight on a dry matter basis. So obviously, late in the summer, once you've weaned the calves off and that cow's still in the first trimester of gestation, that cow doesn't eat a whole lot. You can crank down intake down to 1.5% of body weight, and that cow's going to get along just fine. On the other hand, once you're at peak lactation, about a month after calving, and especially if it's cold outside, we can easily see intakes jump up to 2.5–3% of body weight pretty easy. And so it's those two components that really determine the amount, not only the concentration of the nutrition that we're getting into the cow, but making sure that we're getting enough so that the cow is able to meet her nutrient requirement needs. So let's talk a little bit about the cow nutrient requirements, and we're kind of talking specifically about calving to breeding here, but this graph kind of shows it throughout the year. It's very similar to the chart that we looked at on the front end. At the bottom, months after calving. On the left, TDN of the diet, or TDN requirements of the cow. And it's the same type of situation. A month or so after calving is when she hits peak lactation. That's when her nutrient requirements are going to peak. And they're going to kind of slide down throughout the summer as that calf grows and becomes much less dependent on the cow. And then we're going to wean that calf off, and her nutrient requirements are going to go to their lowest point during the year. And at that point, that calf inside of her is going to start growing, and we'll start to see the nutrient requirements start to pick back up, and the cycle starts over again. In terms of crude protein, it's a very similar curve. You can see that protein really jumps about a month or so after calving, up to 10, 11, maybe even a little over 11% of the diet. And so that's obviously that's going to be a critical component of the nutrient plan for these cows, and it's going to start to decrease throughout the summer, and it's going to hit its lowest point of somewhere around 7%. Once we kind of get to the point where we're weaning those calves off, or at least those calves are fairly independent of the cow. And then that cycle is going to start over as that calf inside of her starts to grow again. Calcium and phosphorus are two of our main minerals. There's obviously many minerals involved. They're all important, but calcium, phosphorus are two of our larger component minerals in the diet and in terms of nutrient requirement. And you can see that they follow a fairly similar curve to energy and protein. And I think just the main thing on calcium and phosphorus is recognizing that they are important and making sure that the diet is balanced to meet the requirements of the cow. Now, like I said before, minerals, there's lots of minerals that are involved in this deal, and we talked about calcium and phosphorus. Depending on where you're at, copper can also be a very critical mineral that we need to keep track of and kind of know where the nutrient requirements of the cow are and the copper availability in the diet. Here in Minnesota, anyway, copper's pretty variable. It just kind of depends on where you're at. The issue, of course, is that even if there is adequate copper available, there's a lot of other stuff, especially in our soils here, that can easily tie up copper in the body. Things like molybdenum, iron, magnesium, zinc, those types of things. And so when we think about the importance of copper to these cows, it's a critical component of reproduction. And when we look at this copper deficiency spectrum, it can go, if you look there at the bottom of the slide, on the left, a slight copper deficiency can affect the cow and the calf, anywhere from kind of on the low end, maybe some immune system issues, other things. You may not even really notice it, but there could be some immune system issues going on. As the deficiency intensifies, what we typically see are repro issues in the cow. And at the very extreme end, which is pretty rare, but it does happen, it can go all the way to seeing birth defects in the calf, in those types of things. So copper is very critical in these cow diets. Now, when you look at this slide, one of the things I wanted to point out is looking for signs of copper deficiency. And so the reason that this kind of becomes important is, like I say, you may have, if you just did a test on your feedstuffs, it may show that there's plenty of copper in the diet. But what it's not able to show is all of the other things that may be tying copper up and making it unavailable to the animals. So even though there's plenty of copper in the diet, there actually is a deficiency at a metabolic level in the animal. So what are some things that we can look for? This is probably a little more at the extreme end of the spectrum, but you certainly see it a lot, and therefore it's probably important to point out. Is you look at the red tinge on these black calves, that's a pretty good indicator of some level of copper deficiency, and possibly maybe even some other mineral deficiency issues. But typically when you see this red tinge on these black calves, that's a pretty good indicator of some copper deficiency issues. Failure for them to really slick out in the summertime is another thing that you'll typically see with these types of mineral deficiencies. So, when we look at, particularly with copper, feeding a well-balanced trace mineral, most of the time will alleviate any of these copper deficiency issues. But obviously, the absorption of copper can be an issue because it can be tied up by other things, as we've talked about. And so, using a high copper breeding mineral in some situations may be the way to go. I really recommend, if you think you're having some issues, talk to your veterinarian, have some actual liver biopsies taken. A liver biopsy can be done on a live animal, it doesn't hurt it, but it can give you a pretty good idea of what's really going on, because just adding more and more copper is not necessarily better, because how the liver absorbs copper, how it stores copper, we don't really have a real great understanding of that. And so sometimes you just actually have to sample to see what's really going on. A couple other minerals of particular importance that I think oftentimes are overlooked. Number one is salt. Make sure that cattle always have access to salt. Free choice. It can be in a block. It can be in a loose salt. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure that they are able to have access to it all the time. The other thing, of course, is water. And that kind of, a lot of times you think, well, that's obvious. And it is obvious. But one of the issues that we have, especially as you get up here in the north, is water in the wintertime. Either, fountains freeze, or they're froze part of the day. Surface water freezes and you have to chop ice. Whatever the situation is, the leading cause of death in mature cows in Minnesota is lack of water and compaction. Well, the leading cause of death is compaction, which is caused by not getting enough water in the wintertime. And that's, if you talk to the veterinarians down at the U in St. Paul, that's what they'll tell you, is when they see the most mature cow deaths is in the wintertime, and it's always compaction, usually a low quality roughage, not enough water, that type of thing. So you got to make sure that cows have access to water at all times. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ration intake. And when we kind of talked about, we alluded to this earlier, but if you look at this graph here, again on the bottom we're months after calving. On the left side we're at percent of body weight on a dry matter basis of the ration. Okay, and you can see that obviously intake spikes when we hit peak lactation a month or so after calving, and that's going to be compounded for those of us that calve pretty early in the spring, because it's going to be cold too, and typically in the springtime you get more wind, which dissipates more body heat, and so they have to eat more to stay warm, and also to provide the nutrients necessary for lactation, maintenance, so on and so forth. And then obviously the amount of dry matter that the animal eats is going to start to go down as we go through the summertime. We get further away from calving. The milk production load is lower. The calf is more independent, and we'll see the lowest level of intake, somewhere around weaning time, kind of at the end of the summer, until that calf inside of her really starts to grow again, and then you'll start to see intakes start to pick up again. That, and usually it's starting to get a little cooler, so that's also going to influence intake level. All right, so what I did here is I just put together some example rations for mature cows 30 days post-calving, because that's our most critical period. All right. Now, if you look at this graph, or this table, I guess, on the left side we've got a variation of different ration ingredients, and we don't have to use them all. These are just some examples, okay? And the first three columns on the left side where it says example rations are dry matter basis, and the next three columns are on an as-fed basis. But the rations are in the columns, so ration 1, ration 2, ration 3 on a dry matter basis, and then the exact same ration 1, 2, and 3 on an as-fed basis. And so you can see for ration 1, if all we are feeding is grass hay, we're going to need about 31 pounds of dry matter, or about 37 pounds as fed. And in most cases, that should be sufficient to maintain a cow. If it's good quality hay, that should be sufficient to maintain a cow. Now, good quality hay is not always possible, and so we got to mix some other things into the ration to try and balance it a little bit. And so if you take a look at ration number 2, we've got about 14.5% corn silage, not 14.5%, 14 pounds of corn silage, 13 pounds of stover, and just about a pound of dry distillers would make a nice little ration. And so if you look at ration number 2 on the right, as fed, that same ration, what you would actually put in the bunk is 37 pounds of corn silage, 18 pounds of stover, and a pound of dry distillers. Okay. Ration 3 is the same type of deal, just some different ingredients: grass hay, corn stover, and corn grain. And you can see how that breaks out there. And so any one of those rations, depending on the quality of the feed ingredients, should be more than adequate to maintain a mature beef cow at peak lactation. Now, for heifers, first calf heifers, you've got a similar type of deal. Now, again, on the previous example rations and this set of example rations, I've already calculated in the intake level of about 2.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis. And so you're not going to need to adjust that until you get, a little bit further away from calving. If you've still got cows on feed, if they're not out on grass yet, you'll start to notice that they're either not finishing the ration, they're leaving some in the bunk, or they're starting to get a little bit fat. And that'd be a good time to start dialing down intake a little bit, as well as maybe even reducing the energy concentration in some of these rations if you think that's necessary. For first calf heifers, of course, we got to remember that there's a couple things going on with heifers that are different from the mature cow. Of course, she's still growing primarily. She doesn't have the critical body mass that a cow does to stay warm, and so she requires a higher level of energy just to stay warm, because she's probably used a lot of her fat reserves over the winter just for growing and maintenance. And so it's harder for a heifer to store some fat to insulate herself from the cold like a mature cow can. And so typically we bump the energy level up in these heifer rations just a little bit more. Now, that being said, good quality hay, you can still run a first calf heifer on good quality grass hay, no problem. The big thing is just number one, making sure that the nutrient composition is there to meet her needs, and number two, make sure she gets enough of it. And that can be difficult because in a lot of herds, the heifers and the cows run together, and that's generally not a real great situation for the heifers if you can split them out, because they're just physically not big enough to compete with boss cow for space at the bunk or space at the hay feeder or whatever situation you got out there. So if at all possible, separate out those heifers, put them on their own ration, and their long-term performance will be much, much better for you, and she'll stay in the herd a lot longer. A lot of these heifers that run with the cows over the winter, they drop out either the next breeding season or the next. About 65% of them drop out in those types of scenarios. So it's definitely worth the time and trouble if you can swing it. Keep these heifers separate. You can look at these rations here. I've kind of talked you through how the graph works, or how the table works. Take a look at those. Those are some good options in terms of coming up with some rations for first calf heifers. Okay, now one thing that has come up, at least here in Minnesota, I expect in some other places as well, we're really short on roughage. Okay, we had a terrible summer last summer. A lot of hay couldn't even get put up. A lot of corn stalks never got put up. At least up until recently, any type of roughage, it didn't matter how good or how poor it was. Even the poorest stuff, bringing $150 a ton. And so that's not real sustainable for most guys. Break-even daily ration cost at $150 roughage is about $3.79 per cow per day And so that's not going to work for a very long period of time. So we're going to maybe have to do, some guys are going to have to do some things different. So what I did is I put together some rations that could substitute some of that roughage for corn, because in a lot of cases, at least here in Minnesota right now, corn is cheaper on a ton basis than roughage is. And so there may be some opportunities for some guys to save some money, some pretty serious money, by substituting corn for where they would normally feed some of that more expensive roughage. And so on the left side group of rations, you can see these are the original rations from the previous table. Okay, and so those you'll see on an as-fed basis. Those are the same that were in about 3 slides ago for the mature cows. Okay, on the right side are the same rations, but with a reduced roughage component. And so what we've done is we've taken some of that roughage and substituted corn in there. And then at the bottom you can see I split out the roughage cost and the total ration cost based on leaving the roughage in there or taking the roughage out and replacing it with corn. You could take a look at that and you could see that there's some pretty significant savings. If you're in a tight roughage situation, there's some pretty significant savings that can at least get you through a few months, some of these really critical months, until we hit green grass here sometime in May. And I think this will be useful for a lot of guys to kind of make that leap. So, on a final note, just remember that it's normal and it's okay for cows to lose a little bit of weight during the peak lactation period. That's been shown to be quite beneficial to the cow. And by a little bit of weight, we're talking about a half a body condition score, which for the most part is roughly 40 pounds. Now, if she's dropping down to a body condition score 4, that's obviously not what we want. But if she goes from a 5.5 to a 5, or a 5 to a 4.5, that's probably not a big deal. They may even lose a little bit more if they were pretty fat to begin with. And so just because a cow's losing a little bit of weight, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We just don't want it to get to the point where she's pretty thin and there's a good chance she's not going to breed back. And the thing we're really shooting for is, let's just make sure she's about a body condition score 5 by breeding time. And if we can accomplish that, that's really the goal of our nutritional program on these cows. It doesn't need to be much more fancy than that. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today. I appreciate you guys taking just a few minutes here to stop by and take a look at this. If you do end up having any questions, you want to talk through some of these rations or anything, there's my contact information. Don't hesitate to call or email. Get a hold of me in some fashion, and we can discuss some of those things. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks a lot.